The aim of this podcast is to bring attention to what modern day humans ignore. Living lives in fabricated personalities, enslaved to compulsion. The facets of the human animal have to be rediscovered. We need to wake up. I am excited to bring you the Evolution podcast. Have you ever heard of the spinal engine theory?
No, I don't. I can't say that I have.
The spinal engine theory basically is this theory, I think, around the 70s or 80s. Sergei Grakovetsky came up with this explanation for what's commonly misunderstood about the spine, right? What's commonly understood about the spine is that it's a column that's supporting the pelvis and the shoulder and keeps us erect. But Grakovetsky came up with this idea that if it was meant to do that, why would it be curved? Why would it not be straight? Because a straight spine would hold weight much better. But we see that it's curved. So that's really interesting, because then the idea of how we looked at the spine started changing. And it brought in this idea of locomotion is generated by the spine, hence the spinal engine theory, which is super interesting because what do we think about when we're trying to move? Like, how do we generate motion? What do humans normally do to generate motion? You would think the legs. The legs are driving, the ground underneath you, pushing it behind you, and then you have forward motion. But it seems to be not the case. It seems that the spine is undulating as we walk forward. What does that mean? It means the same undulation that we see in a fish. An undulation is basically like a spinal wave side to side, and how the fish translates motion is exactly how we translate motion. But the spine is doing that undulation bit, and then the force is translated through our legs. And so it's so interesting. They took a man basically with no forelimbs, and they asked him to walk, and he had no legs attached to his pelvis, which is confusing, because like, how do you walk? But it seems that he could still translate force from the spine itself to the ground and continue forward motion. So they clearly lined his back with a marker pen, and you can see that each step that he tries to take forward, the spine is undulating. And so the torque is actually created from the spine and not from the legs. That's insane.
Wow. That is insane. Like, if you'd have just asked me normally, what do you think about, like, how do people move, right? That's not the first fucking thing that I jump to. The way you imagine, at least from my knowledge of the central nervous system, is you have the brainstem that extends into the spinal cord, and, you have these peripheral nerves that go into the limbs, right? And that's how that effector stimuli system sort of works. You have the stimulus, and then the effector tells it, and then you move your limbs. But taking this into consideration, that's nuts. Well, I think what's more interesting in all of that is the fact that the spine itself generates that thrust and that torque, and it doesn't really have any other component that goes into it. That's mad.
Right. Yeah, it is, because now we're looking at the fish, now we're looking at the snake, and we're seeing that the same movements that caused them to move forward, we have. And so that's a clear transition from how evolution came about for human beings. Let me fuck you up even more. The craziest part about all this...
Oh, no.
The same motor neurons that control the spinal undulation in a fish is molecularly identical to the same motor neurons that control the spinal undulation in a human being. Molecularly identical, as in we have the exact same neurons that control the fish controlling us. What it is for the humans is we have more rows of these motor neurons, and they all exist in the same location, and they're expanding. It's like we're unlocking and achieving new abilities. So for humans, the other motor neurons that we have that the fish don't have, they control our peripheral movements. They control all the other movements that we can do. But the undulation in itself, the same movement that we inherited from the fish, uses the same exact motor neurons, identical. That blows my mind. Like, how do we not understand that we're still animals? I was talking to someone recently about just just it was like an everyday life issue, and I was reminding them that we're animals and we're living as literal gorillas who are talking through scripts that we've created, and now we exist in this like uh made up reality, but we tend to forget that we're literally fucking animals. And stuff like this, when it comes out, like, you cannot ignore this stuff. And I don't know, I'm just one of those people who are so extremely passionate about understanding that we're truly evolved from animals, and we have nothing different about us. We're just able to sit
Yeah.
here with a little bit of fucking ego to say that we're not these animals. But imagine that.
Yeah.
Imagine the identical cell existing on us. We're fishes, but just a little bit more in terms of like ability.
To a large degree, I kind of it doesn't sort of surprise me, um, because of the way that that evolution works and that we understand. It's not a matter of opinion anymore.
Yeah.
We've been exploring this for such a long amount of time, and it's like the evidence is there. The proof is in the pudding, and the pudding is there for you to taste. It just people just don't want to take it, and it's annoying to a larger degree than it is believable that people just don't want to take it for granted.
Mm.
But yeah,
I mean, which brings me to the whole topic of movement, right? Like, we as animals, if we've developed and inherited all these primal ancient movements from our ancestors, including like unicellular organisms, we have all these movements downloaded in us that we are unaware of using. Like, whoever thought that the spinal undulation is what's causing the torque that's required for your legs to move front and propel you forward? Who would have ever thought of that if it wasn't Grakovetsky to bring that stuff up? And a normal everyday human being is not thinking about that. So in that same manner, we have all these movements downloaded into us. And it brings me to this interesting point where I think that movement is attached to thought, right? And I very strongly believe this because I experienced this on a very profound nature. And it truly has changed my life once I started understanding that my thought is influenced by my movement, and my movement is influenced by my thought. And the more postured your movement is, the more postured your thinking is. And that's crazy because you start to understand that as a human being, if you don't explore the way that you are flexible in movements, and the way that you can experiment in movements, and the way that you can use all these different permutations and combinations to create different types of movements, which is why we've evolved to have all these different structures of motor neurons, we tend to forget that that is what has created thought. And so if thought stagnates, your movement stagnates. If movement stagnates, your thought stagnates. And that it opens up a whole world of experimentation, which is why I really want to talk about it on this podcast, because I feel like this is one of the most important things for humans to address. Because in our society now, what we see is we're sitting on chairs, very, very static position that we would have never assumed in the wilderness. We have not evolved to sit on chairs. In fact, in nature, if you try to sit in this position for a very long time, it would be rather uncomfortable. We need to squat. That's the most basic resting position that we have, a squat, right? And so because we don't squat anymore, and I'm not talking about squat in lifting heavy weights, that's not really that beneficial. And I'll come to the point where we discuss the gym culture and everything. I have a tad bit against only using resistance training to understand movement. But before I come to that, like, imagine all the movements that we have lost on the way because of the society that doesn't encourage movement. We encourage fitness and movement, which are two different things. And I want to make this very clear.
Yeah.
Movement does not necessarily mean fitness. It keeps you fit because that's what you're supposed to be doing. But you could still fuck your life up with everything else. It's not movement that's keeping you fit. Fitness is a very umbrella term that you can guide in many different facets of life. But just think about it. All the movements that we lost over time, you know, we don't squat anymore on a daily basis. Like 70% of your life would be squatting if you were out in nature. You'd be squatting to rest. You'd be squatting to crawl on the floor. You'd be squatting to climb trees. You'd be squatting every fucking where. Okay, we've lost squatting. We've lost um like our pole motion. We used to climb trees all the time. We're tree dwelling creatures. You know, we've lost that. If we go far back into evolution, where, the spinal undulation in itself, we could be using that movement. Who on a daily basis undulates their spine to like crawl on the floor? We don't do that. And even the fact that I'm saying it like this, some people might think it's funny. If I'm asking you to practice spinal, like crawl like a worm, I'll say, crawl like a worm, every day. Yeah. Practice it. They will think, what the fuck are you saying? That's not fitness. But this is why I'm doing this episode today, because I've been practicing this for a while now, and what I've gained from this is a vast amount of knowledge that I would not have been able to credit to anything else but experimentation of movement. And I've created this how would you say? It's not a practice, but I've created this way that you could learn how to use your thought and movement. And I'm sure it's like inspired by every other movement aficionado that I listen to and watch and observe. However, I found it best to put it in the way that I have. So one of the practices that I guide my close people to do is experimentation with all types of movement, no matter how silly it is, no matter how crazy it can look, no matter what kind of sounds you make. You practice movement by being a true animal. And I'll give you an example of what I've been doing for the past year-ish. I wake up very early in the morning, and obviously your natural elements also guide the way that the movements happen, which is so interesting. This topic is abundant, and I want to get to everything in it. But this movement that I'm doing starts like this, right? I get up early in the morning. I go to this field laid out in turf and grass, and I just start crawling like a gorilla. I just start doing primal movements inspired by people that I saw crawling like gorillas. And I'm like, what is this? I'm going to try this. I'm just going to see what happens. And I start to do it. And I start to notice the way that my eyes are functioning are different. What does that mean? That means the percentage of what I'm focusing on, or the distance of my retinal focus, is differing. I'm like, okay, that's very interesting. My auditory perception starts to change a little bit. It becomes more focused. That's very interesting as well. What am I doing? I'm just crawling like a gorilla. Why is that affecting it? My emotions are changing. It's becoming a little more aggressive, I would say, but not in the sense of I want to go hunting, but in the sense of focus, pure focus. And I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. What happens if I go lower? And so I start to go lower, and I start to crawl like a reptile. Instant change. And I'm so fascinated by what's happening. My focus now is very short, because I don't have the ability to look very far ahead of me. I'm looking at the ground, like I'm crawling like a lizard. And then I'm looking at each blade of grass. Each blade of grass is so beautifully defined in its visual image. And I'm looking at it. Each blade of grass has its own uniqueness to it, and I'm observing it. This is creating a difference in my emotion, because now I'm curious. The curious emotion of experimenting what nature looks like. It's starting to make me think about the way that the lizards view life, the way that reptiles view life. And it's not as simple as saying reptiles view life from a lower angle, and so it's different, but that is a huge aspect of it. Reptiles view life from way down, way down, right below the ground, unless they're like on a tree or
Yeah.
they're climbing a surface or something. But their focus is very narrow. They're
Yeah.
not looking as far. They have very different perceptions of what we're looking at. But you are able to do that as a human being. You are able to put
Mhm.
yourself in similar positions. And so as I start to crawl, as I start to notice each blade of grass being more and more defined, my hearing becomes incredibly more defined. It's like if I was able to tell you that I'm the focus in my eyes, I can shift my focus from a far object to a near object. That's what I was able to do with my hearing. And then that changed my emotion even more.
Right.
Now I'm curious, but as I'm curious, I'm starting to get aggressive. But I would like to note here that aggression is not the way. When I speak of aggression in this context, it's not the way that I'm, like, angry or anything. It's not aggression like that, but it's intense curiosity to the point where even if I saw a bug or something, I would feel like eating it. I can't explain this. It's because these emotions are like sprouting from what the movement is causing it to do. And so I start to crawl in different positions now because I'm so intrigued about what's happening. And what I did, bro, was I was in what I call the first quadrant, right? And I've split these into now 4 quadrants. The first quadrant is when you're extremely low to the ground. The second quadrant is when you're moving in like squat positions. You could say like the gorilla walk, just like bear crawls and stuff like that. The third quadrant is a little more upright position, and the fourth quadrant is a fully erect human being standing and walking. And holy shit, this has changed my life. And I need to tell you about this, bro, because it's so deeply and profoundly affected the way that I think. It's so deeply affected the way that I observe each and every single movement that I do, the way that I'm using body language to speak. Completely different. So let's talk about it one by one, right? In the first quadrant, what happens for me, and I would like to keep this open because the whole point of me encouraging human beings to get into movement is experimentation. And I can go off on a limb here onto so many things, but the reason that we need to focus more on experimentation and less on repetition is because of the idea that I posed earlier, saying that repetition causes repetitive thought. The structure of thought, it might not be the same exact thought, but you're genreifying your thought. For example, the whole idea of going to a gym and lifting weights for 10 reps, 12 reps, 15 reps, every single day, 5 days a week, 6 days a week, you're repeating the same movements and again and again, you might get results from it. There's no benefit to having bigger and bigger muscles. After a point, when strength is achieved, when you are able to fully lift whatever you want to, you have to like start to understand that you're going too far now. You're creating disabilities for yourself. You're not enabling yourself in any amazing way because you're repetition. So I realized that because I used to body build for like a year or two, and that's how I started my weight loss journey. And as I started to realize that, it became so mundane for me that these are the ways that humans are trying to become healthy. We've moved so far away from what movement was and why we developed such a infrastructure of sophisticated nature that we can think about such things with strategy. We can think about such profound mathematical, formulaic, optical environments where you look in between trees and you're able to create pathways. This doesn't happen by repetitive movement. It doesn't happen like that. It happens because you're able to strategize, because you're experimenting, because you're moving through things, that you're like, fluid movement is what we need as human beings. And it's not just about health, it's about evolving thought. If you want to evolve as mankind, you have to understand that mankind has evolved from movement. And I believe this very strongly, and I think there should be more research done into this. And a lot of neurosurgeons are actually getting into this, and I love it because there's so many resources now to really discuss this. And I've just been diving straight into this. And stop me at any point if I'm going too far, but I'd like to expand a little more.
No, please carry on. Continue enlightening me. This is fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So I'd like to expand a little more on these quadrants that I've created, right? Um, I mean, it has nothing to do with my creation. I believe that I've put it in a way for people to understand. And I have trained a couple
Yeah.
of my friends, and we get together sometimes and we just move in ways like this, and it's very fascinating. So the first quadrant is all types of movement that has to do with being as close to the ground as possible. And the first and very main
Right.
thing that I tell people when we're doing these movement practices is, do not think of it as movement practices. This isn't about movement. This isn't about being healthy. This isn't about using your body the best way that you can. It is, but that's not the point of it. And then they get confused. What are you talking about? Like, we're moving, we're doing these crazy things. Like, it has to be about movement practice. No, it's about the thought. And they always get confused when I say that, because what the fuck? Like, what do you mean thought? And here's why I say this. Because everything that we do as human beings works in a symbiotic fashion, and it works in a cooperative manner. We work as one unit of a machine. We cannot segregate movement into one thing, thinking practice into one thing, meditation into one thing. That's a very stupid way to look at how the human being functions, and that's not the way we're supposed to be practicing life or gaining expertise in using the animal. And so the reason I say thought is because it's so contradictory to what we're doing, and that it phases them for a second. The point is still that we're functioning as one unit. The point is still that we're functioning as a machine that's in cooperation. But when I say it's about thought, it phases them. And they're like, what do you mean about thought? And so it immediately distances them from the idea that this is a movement practice, and that's what I want. I want to achieve I don't know what the fuck this is type of attitude when you're getting into it, because that's how I got into it and that's how it works.
Right.
So once you start that, you're not paying attention to each movement. And this is important. Why? Because your body has a natural memory of what these movements are. And so if you start to pay attention to how to move, what you're going to do is you're going to use the closest thing that you remember on how to move to utilize your memory of what movement is. And then you're working off posture again. You're working off an egocentric way of moving, and that defeats the purpose. So what I say is, this is not a movement practice. There is no right way of moving. You're just going to be an animal. You're going to crawl on the floor like it means nothing to you. You don't know what the fuck you're doing, but you're going to be as animalistic as possible. If you need to spit. If you need to blow your nose. Be crazy. Be an animal. Be as uncivilized as possible. Not intentionally, but if that's the feeling, then do it. And that was the breakthrough for me.
Yeah.
Because when I truly realized that nobody was watching, and I think that was a benefit that I was doing it so early in the morning when it was so dark and nobody was really watching, because I feel like I would have been uncomfortable if people were watching what I was doing. But since nobody was watching, I was completely comfortable with being so vigorously animalistic that because I would be breathing different, I would start to breathe in fashions that people would have thought were scary if they saw me. I'm 100% sure that if somebody came across me when I was doing something like that, they would have freaked out and they would have ran away or called the cops or some shit on me. But my mom said that too. She was like, be careful. Like, if somebody sees you, call the cops. And I could definitely see that because my hair is down. If you go to my Instagram, you'd see a video of my hair down and I'm just like crawling on the floor. It's the funniest thing ever.
For fuck's sake.
It's so important to allow yourself to be like that, because who the fuck sat here and told us to be civilized? Who the fuck sat here and told us to be wearing these suits and having intellectual conversations? I'm wearing this suit because I think I look fly as fuck in this suit. That's a different subject. But
Amen.
Thank you. But what it is the true understanding that humans don't need to be civilized. We're wild. And in allowing that wildness to come out, what you're doing is not allowing yourself to be free. What you're doing is allowing all that prehistoric memory that you have to function. And you're allowing that to flow out of you. And that is so intensely profound. There's no other way that I can define it. You are allowing this fluidity of evolution to come out and be you. And you are observing it. And it changed my life. There's no way that I can put this in any other way, bro. But so the first quadrant, and you're crawling on the floor, you're doing all these like weird types of movements, and
Yeah.
immediately my instinct is to like growl, breathe differently, focus my eyes on things. And you know what I realized? My confidence is changing. What is confidence? Confidence is, such a structured way of thinking in a human facet, right? Like the word confidence itself
Mm.
it has its own box of what the definition and what the feeling is. But then my
Yeah.
confidence starts to increase. So then I start to think, do lizards have confidence? What is this feeling? There's so much to explore. And and then I realized that it's just it's just the chemical state right now. My state of chemistry is changing because the way of my position is changing. And obviously there's a learning curve a little bit
Mm.
because there's musculature fatigue. And each time you're in a position that you're not very used to, you have to focus on the pain immediately. It distracts you. So once you get past that threshold, it's very easy to start to become um like wide focus aware, widely aware of these things that are happening. And so once
Mm.
that started happening, it became even more deep for me. But thankfully, I'm fluid in most ways that I don't need to focus too much on my pain. I can move pretty comfortably in the ways that I choose to. And so that increased the way that I was thinking. So what I did was I stayed in this position for 30 minutes, just moving. First quadrant. I stayed in the first quadrant for like about 30 to 40 minutes, moving around the floor, crawling, snake crawl, crazy as shit. And I didn't want to growl as much because when I come to the second quadrant, I'll say a little bit more about the growling and the aggression part of it. But the first quadrant, I can't explain any better than saying curious, 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 curious. Sense is heightened to a point that it's never been heightened before. I'm crawling on the floor. I'm able to view every blade of grass. I'm able to hear everything so clearly. And then I start to observe a quadrant of the world. And I'm talking about the reason I use quadrants is because the way that I started viewing the world was now in quadrants. As in, my
Mm.
ocular angle is now changed because I'm on the floor, which humans don't
Mm.
necessarily. We don't ever have like a low angle to the world. We always have like eye level, upright. We're like at least 5 foot, 6 feet off the ground. That's how we look at the world, and so that's going to shape the way that the distance is perceived. That's going to shape certain optical
Yeah.
illusions, and
Yeah.
obviously when you change that ocular angle, now there's different optical illusions. There's different auditory illusions, and I say illusions because everything is an illusion, right? The way that you perceive the world is in your mind. Um, and so I'm viewing the world from this lower angle, and that changes everything. Every fucking thing. It changed everything, and I'm like, what the hell is happening? And I'm
Mm.
so confused, but in a very student mindset. And I'm crawling on the floor, and okay, now at this point I'm getting fatigued because the 30 minutes of being like on the floor is very difficult. And so I was like, okay, now I move. I
Yeah.
get up. At this point, I don't know the concept of quadrants yet. I haven't termed it. This is just me experimenting. And then I start the gorilla walk, right? On
Mm.
my, like this. I use
Yeah.
this hand posture, and I start to walk. And, I'm a little bit higher off the ground. My ocular angle has changed. And because my ocular angle has changed, my emotions have changed. Imagine feeling that when you're in the gym.
Right.
Just imagine every time you bicep curled and every time you had a lat pull down that your emotions would change, that your thought would change. The structure of it is
Changed me.
changing. It is actually changing, but we don't observe it because we're
Yeah.
observant of very different things. But the difference in emotion, the difference in perception, even just physical perception as opposed to interoception, changed. And because I was doing it for 30
Mm.
minutes, it was almost as profound as when I started crawling from an upright position. You know what I mean? Because there's a drastic difference, a drastic contrast
Yeah.
into observing the world when you're standing up as opposed to
Mm.
crawling on the floor. So now there's a contrast between crawling on the floor and crawling like a gorilla, or like, what would you say, walking like a gorilla. As a
Mm.
what is the word for quadrupedal, right? So when you're quadrupedal, it's different. And
Yeah.
So the position of being quadrupedal and you're crawling like a gorilla, my emotions are changing, and because my emotions are changing, there's certain reactions that I want to outlet. Like my body is starting to vent different things, and by that, what I mean is when I started to growl,
Hmm.
it became even more now, and I'm sure this has to do with all the environmental things that were happening around me. Because like early in the morning here, where I stay, kind of upstate, is a very country like place, right? There's mountains everywhere. There's
Yeah.
and if you're out late at night and there's like isolation everywhere, you see black bears here, you see deers, you see black bears, you see raccoons, skunks. And so
Hmm.
early in the morning, I have that fear in me. My adrenaline is very high because I know that I might be face to face with a black bear, and I've seen one before, and when I was alone. So like, what are you fucking gonna do? Like, you get mauled to death if it's angry. So I'm aware of this, but let me tell you what happened. People might think this is silly, but this has truly changed the way that I've viewed confidence. Um, and it's not so manufactured. I've figured out where confidence comes from, and it has nothing to do with being confident and training your mind to be confident. It has nothing to do with sitting your shoulders straight like
Right.
this. That's like a very vague way of saying it. But let me explain to you what happened in the second quadrant. As I'm starting to growl, I'm becoming more aggressive. My breathing pattern is starting to change. My thoughts are starting to change. And I must note here that in the first two quadrants, at least as of now, there is no thought. There is no egoistic thought. There is no I
Hmm.
have to do my homework. There is no I have to grow my pod. None of that shit. Like, you're so animalistic, and this
Mm.
has to do with the fact that I've meditated before, and this has to do with the skill that I've developed to also not have mental diarrhea all the time. Uh, but I was in that position. So
Right.
as that started to happen, you are so focused on what is happening right now because you're in such a different position that you would be doing a disservice to yourself by being able to think about something else. But it's so profound to any human because we don't do it on a daily basis, moving like that. Even, in fact, a close friend of mine, she was trying the movements too, and then immediately after she was trying it, like, her thoughts also
Yeah.
kind of died down because it's so different. We don't do this on a daily basis. So when you start doing it, you're so like
Mm.
intrigued, your thoughts automatically die down. This is the nature of what a human's supposed to be. You're supposed to be curious all the time. And when you're curious and when you're occupied by learning everything like a
Mm.
5-year-old child would or a 2-year-old child would, you view life in such a way that you're constantly absorbing information. So the thoughts really don't necessarily flush your mind. And I start to aggressively breathe a little bit. I start to become more confident because there is no sense of
Mm.
insecurity anymore. Insecurity is caused by the thought. And so, because there's no sense of insecurity, confidence naturally goes up. Confidence was never a thing to develop. Confidence is a thing that's supposed to be brushed off. You
Mm.
have shit on it. You brush the shit off, and then
Yeah.
you're naturally confident.
Mm.
Um, and so, naturally, what my mind started to think was, as I became more aggressive, I could feel this urge of energy, like surge of energy. And I thought naturally, this wasn't like a human articulated thought. This was just, I know if a black bear comes in front of me right now, I'll bite the fuck out of it. That's literally how I was thinking. And it may be stupid, right? It may be stupid to think that you would win a
Mm.
fight. But I don't care what anyone says. This is genuinely how I felt in the moment because I was in a position of
Mm.
of it was just the thing. It was like, if a black bear comes, it comes. Like, what am I gonna do? I'll take the
Right.
safest route. Obviously, I wasn't gonna
Yeah.
actually physically battle a black bear because I'm still smart. I can still think. But in that moment, I knew that in if there was a situation where I was face to face with a natural, predator or something like that, I'm okay. And it's like, we can fight if we want to.
Mm.
It sounds crazy, man, but like, it's
Right.
not the fact that I'm not saying that I could actually win with a black bear, but that feeling is like, you're not thinking about anything else. Like, in that aggression that I was in, it was crazy.
Mm.
And spent 30 minutes in that. And I would love to get deeper into this
Yeah.
topic with like an actual movement uh, s- uh, aficionado. And in fact, we have a quite an interesting guest coming on
Mm.
in in a couple episodes, we have quite an interesting guest who can speak to movement a lot more than I can. But this is an interesting topic to hit, and we will get deeper there. And then I moved to the third quadrant. Third quadrant is slightly more upright, not as four-limbed. Sometimes, move with two legs, but you're not spine erect, not standing up, not legs erect. You're still moving. Changes. Bro, it's so intense. How do I explain this? Your ocular angle is changing in each quadrant, and I'll tell you what I fucking noticed here. I'm not as focused on each blade of grass. What am I starting to notice? I'm starting to notice what is ahead of me instead of what is right in front of me. Just think about that for a second. My ocular vision now, the focus is increasing. What does that do? I'm starting to observe things that are in front of me. And if I just had to think about this philosophically, what is happening? I'm able to, if there's distance, what is prediction? Think about the nature of prediction. Prediction is to predict something that is ahead of you in time. And I start to naturally kind of correlate these two things as I'm starting to move. And as I'm starting to see things that are further away from me, I'm able to predict, how much distance does that take for me to get there? I start to think a little bit more human-like. I start to think, how long does it take for me to get there? I'm calculating. So weird. No calculation before that. It was just pure emotion, pure aggression, pure chemical state of mind. And then you start to use the cognitive aspect of being a human being. And that tripped me out, because now thought started to increase a little bit. I'm not as focused as I was on movement, because my back is kind of straight. My legs, I'm in a squat position. I'm basically crawling in a squat position. And I'm starting to notice things. I'm looking ahead of me, in front of me. And that starts to give some thought, like, oh, the tree is green. Oh, the tree is further away from me. Oh, that tree is bigger than that tree. There's contemplation. I can't stress how important this was for me to realize that may not be the way that other animals are thinking. They may not be contemplating in distance. They may be contemplating in like their short focus. But that was like a differentiation for me, a contrast in the way that my thought was functioning. And then eventually I spent 30 minutes there.
Yeah.
And then when I stood up, it blew everything in my every cell of my body just awoke with this crazy amount of understanding. When I stood up, I understood why humans are strategic beings. I understood why humans are able to create emotional connection on a deep level. And furthermore, the results that you gain from doing this practice alone versus with people changes everything as well. There's a collaboration effect to it. There's a collaboration emotion to it. You see why there's a community aspect of what the animal is in all different quadrants. And as I stood up, I'll speak to how I felt when I was alone first and then with people. When I was alone and I stood up, you are so not focused on the movement now, because where am I now? I am in the comfort zone of what a human's movement is. I'm standing upright. My legs know what they're going to do, right? I'm subconsciously walking. I'm subconsciously moving. I don't need to focus as much anymore because it's part of my posture. It's part of my thoughts posture. It's part of my repetition that I've done for all my life. So my thought is not focused there anymore. Where's my thought now? It can be anywhere. So now I'm able to strategize. I'm looking at the sun. You know what I was thinking? Before sunrise, I was looking at these stars and I'm standing upright. I'm looking at the stars as in, what is the sky? I'm thinking about these things. What is the sky? What are the stars? Why are there stars? What are these pretty things? What is the ground? Why is it so far away from each other? I am contemplating, strategizing these different things. And then I start to realize that as the human spine became more erect and erect, we started to change as human beings. And in fact, you start to realize that in research, they've come to the conclusion that once the human being started to become upright and the spine became erect, our evolution was tenfold quicker. exponentially quicker once the spine became erect, and it became clear to me why. And this was not knowledge that I had before it. This was knowledge
Right.
that I gained after it, because I had to search what was happening. Ooh, and the emotion that I felt when I kind of downloaded the understanding as to why we function as human beings, as to why we are able to create a alternate life in psychology, because we're not focused on being movement animals. We don't need to focus on these
Right.
movements. We
Right.
don't need to focus on every minute detail.
Mm.
But that's what you're doing in the first quadrant, right? In the first quadrant, everything is surprising you. The curiosity is keeping you away from the nature of thought. Do you understand what I'm saying? The curiosity of this
Yeah.
animal that's able to view
Absolutely
each
do.
blade of grass, each dew of water on the blade of grass, the soil, the way that it functions, the not the microorganisms, but the organisms in the soil, the way that they're moving, the relationship between the
Mm.
plant and the soil. These are things that humans can focus on if they choose to, but it's the way that our oculus focus works, that our thought focus works as well, in my opinion. The thought can be narrowed, which we call focus, and the thought can be broadened, which we call awareness. And likewise for animals as well.
Right.
But I don't know how much they can broaden their thing. But it became clear to me that there's a relationship between ocular focus and thought process focus, right? Awareness and focus. And then I start to realize that once you start distancing yourself from a focused point of view and you adopt a more aware point of view in a larger, wider field of perspective, you can be more interoceptive. And that blew my mind again, because what do
Right.
humans live with? We live with psychological realities. We are able to contemplate, attach meaning, attach egoistic meaning, attach observation to inference,
Yeah.
and create language out of this. Then we create language, then we
Mhm.
communicate languages to each other. And now this brings me to training with other
Yeah.
people. What I felt with training with other
Mhm.
people was also extremely fucking crazy. And I'm so sorry I'm not giving you a chance to talk, but it's just it's just so
No, no, please.
profound to me.
It has to come out completely.
So as I was training with some of these men that like we trained together with, we
Yeah.
were doing the first quadrant, right? I was telling people like we're going to stay in the first quadrant for a long time, and immediately from the first quadrant we're gonna skip all the we're gonna skip every other quadrant in between and stand up upright, and we're gonna notice the difference. And I can't speak as to what they noticed. I will allow them to, hopefully at one point, we can bring them, we can bring their experience into a video and post it for people to watch. But what I experienced was completely mind-boggling as well. Like my home life is that recently, but what I realized was after spending around 30 to 40 minutes in the first quadrant, and you stand up, this feeling of focus when it widens like this, what I felt was there was interaction with my peers as we were doing. We start to interact with each other like animals, right? And we allow ourselves to be so fluidly uncivilized that we're doing everything, where I'm crawling up to my friends and pushing them and like making them roll on the floor. My other friend is coming and trying to tangle me up in my movement. My other friend is coming and like kind of pushing my head a little bit. It's just fun play, and I'm going and I'm growling at my friends. It sounds funny, but one of the most profound experiences. And then we stand up, and in time, all of us movements completely changed. All of us started to walk slowly. We started to look above us. We're starting to notice things on a completely different ocular level. We're looking at all of us. Immediately, I looked at everyone. Everyone's looking at the sky. Everyone is looking straight in front of them. That normally they wouldn't do, because this is our usual posture nowadays, right? As humans. But it's so intriguing that you don't hold that ocular posture anymore. That once you start to see it, there's nothing like it, like nothing so profound as nature trying to show you what it is. And so they all took this immediate ocular vision of awareness, wide awareness. And since I was accustomed to it already before, I wanted to be more interoceptive and understand how I was feeling emotionally. And what I felt was a sense of
Mm,
community made me feel even stronger. There was a sense of masculine comparison, right? There was a sense of understanding that these men are,
mm,
uh, as they would walk closer to me, I would feel a little more comfortable. As they would walk away from me, I would start to feel more uncomfortable because I felt like a peer was distancing themselves from me. I started to see how the animal was thinking. And like
mm.
it reminds me of this one example of a zookeeper when they had like a few chimps, right? And on one chimp's birthday, the
Yeah.
zookeeper, it brought a cake and it gave it to the chimp whose birthday
Mm,
it was, and the other chimps uh attacked the zookeeper because they have no sense of like morality. Like it's unfair for them. What they think is like, how the hell can you give them food and not me food? And so like a direct attack on the zookeeper because
mm.
it felt they have a very good sense of fairness, right? And this is a very natural occurring
Right.
environmental evolutionary emotion that even we have deep down. When we get rid of the layers of morality, even we have these things. And so I started to notice that I was feeling a bit of loneliness when they would walk away from me, which was not something I um, feel very often because I've practiced solitude, right? But as they start to distance themselves
Mm,
physically away from me and they start to take different routes, I start to feel slowly lonely. And that was very interesting for me because I haven't felt that in a very long time. And as we start to converge again, then you start to feel comfortable. You start to feel like you have friends. You start to feel like you have community around you. And I can see clearly how humans saw that that was important because that kind of enhanced something that I was feeling. And then each one of them were able to distinguish the difference between how a human was now thinking in the first quadrant and the fourth quadrant, because now they're strategizing, they're looking at things, they're making thought, they're making
mm,
contemplation, they're attaching psychological belief to it.
mm.
And then you start functioning as an animal that's more cerebrally active than physically active.
Right.
uh, i'm just I'm gonna stop here for now, but
That is honestly one of the most that is honestly one of the most fascinating and profound things I've heard you say in a long time, and that's saying something. Like I hear stuff from you all the fucking time, but this is the first time you've come out with such just off the bat, just running straight through the gate. And I can only imagine that's purely because you've meant and felt exactly every single word of what you said, and not to mention the fact that you shared it with the community as well. And it's hard for me to sit here in a position where I've not tried any of these, I've not had any of these experiences, and let alone this is not something that you can just tell me about, and I can share these experiences with you, which at the minute I'm quite regretting, and I feel quite on the receiving end of things. But it's exciting just to know that this realm of you know processes and thoughts and all of this exists, and it all stemmed from your this idea of just being able to move, and you wanted to just translate, and you didn't even go into it with an intention to do anything. It's just you wanted to put yourself in a position where you could trace back to being that primal version of yourself, and you observed yourself, and you were quite observant of how you were feeling and how you were going through each of those phases as you were moving, quadrants as you posed them, and as you were moving, and you used the ocular vision and your ocular um, sort of scope as a metric to measure what each stage of it sort of looked like and what you were observing at each stage, which is even more fascinating because then you took that metric and translated it into something that's a little bit harder to describe, like things that the unprovoked thoughts that you were feeling. It's not
mm,
necessarily compulsion, but it is compulsion in some degree, where you wanted to do
yes.
things like growl, or someone wanted to touch you, someone wanted to put you down. That whole idea of instinctual behavior, but still being observant of your instinctual behavior, that's something I think is quite confined to humans in terms of our ability to cognitively sort of think about the things that we're feeling. Of course, animals go through the same compulsions, and you put yourself in the position of a gorilla, or a position of a deer, or a position of I don't know, whatever you have, a snake. Let's say one example for each quadrant, and then you put yourself in the position of the fourth quadrant of the Homo sapien. It's fascinating to think. Well, it's a bit audacious for me to say that because there's no reason for us to think that they can't comprehend what they're feeling. But the compulsion is similar on all grounds. But what's fascinating to know is if the animals feel the same way as well, which I'm very curious to know. Not just the fact that Is it just all down to cognition? Because if it's the case that the animals can observe the same way that you're observing the feelings and the way that your thoughts are translated and the way that your thoughts are moving across all these quadrants, then it begs the question: is cognition really that necessary? Or is it just a tool that we've sort of developed and we've tried to overuse it to a degree where we've made it necessary? The same way you were way in the beginning of the conversation describing how our posture of sitting down on a chair is something that we compare now to being comfortable. But in fact, that is supposedly the most uncomfortable position that you can be at. The squatting is the resting position. And which, when you said that, it brought into instantly to mind why it's sort of like it's becoming stale, not using that position, not using that posture. Your knees
Yeah.
hurt, your thighs hurt, your quads hurt, everything hurts. Your hips hurt, your back hurt when you start squatting, and then it's become like a training exercise. We're relearning things that we meant to do from the get-go. It was meant to be the basic movement, and it was meant to
Right.
be the resting position back in the and now we're assuming this new level of comfort which we've now just associated to, okay, this is comfort now. There's an element of superiority that goes into it as well, you know. But that's a whole other conversation. I feel like I'm very fascinated by what I've just heard, but my experiences are very limited to obviously not this degree of trying to tap into the primal movements. I think I derive rather a lot of inspiration about movement practices from Ido Portal. He's what you would call a movement practitioner, right? And of course, I don't have to explain that to you. I think as of late, and I mean just very late, just a couple of days, I've been doing this thing where on the only thing similar between what you said and what I've practiced is just the ability to just let go and let the body do its thing at some point. It's this weird sort of dancing thing, if you want to call it that. It's basically flailing, doing whatever the body wants to do at that time, which is a stupid thing to say because you'd imagine you force the body to do something, but it's I can't explain it. The body just does its own thing after a point. You just need to give it a little bit of a start, and I think it was more to do with him, what I'd heard about him doing capoeira, that Brazilian martial art. And I just thought when I watched a couple of videos of people actually practicing, I thought it's just like the fluidity of the things, and it's meant to be a martial art, but there's not actually a lot of conflict going on, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
really understand what's happening, and that sort of drew my attention. It fascinated me a little bit because they were moving in unnatural ways, but there was also an expression of emotion that came into it, and that sort
Right.
of reminded me. I got reminded of that when you were talking about this aggression, which is not necessarily aggression leading to violence or with malicious intent, but just aggressiveness, which is just a very strong urge to follow through with something, but you don't really understand why you feel that urge to begin with. That's something that I wanted to get in tune with, but not necessarily with the intent of getting in tune with aggression, but more in the lines of letting my body feel these compulsions. And I
Mm-hmm.
think to the only extent to which I could describe it is it made, like I said, after a certain point, once you get the ball rolling, the body starts doing its own thing. Muscles are starting to do its own thing. At some point, I felt like I wasn't in control of my body for a bit, which is weird because I could feel myself not being in control of my body. I could observe that I wasn't completely in control of my body, but the intent wasn't to hold back. It wasn't a very, oh my God, I don't have control over my body sort of feeling. It was more like, this is nice. This feels somewhat good and required and to some degree relaxing. So, um,
That's a very interesting point you bring up. I feel like what you're talking about is um, the compulsive aspect of an animal that already exists, and you deriving movement from that, or just allowing this compulsion to take place, and in that
yeah,
taking place, you observe it, and that's it's a
yeah.
very beautiful thing, and which I want to speak about. But please go on.
But all I was saying was, yeah, is as you put it very sort of concisely. But that is my limited experience with this, allowing the body to do its thing and trying to channel these compulsions into movements and seeing and observing what it has a lot of part and parcel to do, and it's a very sort of obvious distinguish uh, well, disambiguation, I should say, between the way that both of us sort of approach things, right? I always have been, and this is to a fault, sort of more um, wanting to deal with the outcome rather than trying to go into it with some sort of intent or with some sort of objective. Whereas if you look at the way that you described everything in such detail, there is a sense of you wanting to put yourself in that position and wanting to explore these things, wanting to feel, wanting to explore, basically just wanting to explore, period. But for me it was more like I just wanted things to happen to see where it go, which are two different things. It wasn't, I didn't go into it with an exploration mindset, but which is why I was more kind of succumbed with the idea of trying to observe these things. But anyway, just to, put a pin in things, my this is my closest observation to what you described, and the if I had to put it into a single word, I'd say that towards the end of it I felt more open, and there is literally no other way I can describe it. I feel like that's an all-encompassing thing that I felt is just open.
Yeah, man. Like that. I'm so glad that you finally tried to experiment in something like that because, as we both know,
Mm,
we the only movement exercises that we both got into from the beginning were movement traditions that had already been set, like
mm,
weightlifting, like sports. Sports is a very good example of being able to use your body the way that you want to. But once you start to reach a
mm,
little bit of proficiency, it becomes very repetitive. But I'm so glad that you
yeah.
finally started to experiment. And I love that you bring that out. That let's get into it, right? What you're talking about is compulsive movement from
Mm,
the animal that exists, right?
yeah.
As you. And
Mm, yeah.
you bring up Ido Portal. Ido Portal is actually a extremely profound person, and I think that the way that he speaks is on par to where I would put Buddhists and Zen monks. And I feel like his understanding of human nature and nature period is so far beyond the people that we generally see and any celebrity that I've really observed. Like Ido Portal is truly, in my opinion, an enlightened being. And one of the things that he brings up with such fervor is that he differentiates movement from movements. And that's a very important distinguishment to make because what is movement? Movement. Let's start with movements because movement is that can get into a discussion, but movements is the way that he describes this is content versus container. And content here would be the movement, container would be the movement. And that means that each movement that you are able to do, each action that you are able to physically imbibe and translate into a physical translation of force, if your limbs or whatever it is, are movements. The actual concept of movement, the way that he explains it, is so beautiful because what he's talking about is an entity. He's talking almost as if it's a living being that functions in the same likelihood that consciousness would function. And when he first brought that up, that was very interesting for me because my definition of consciousness is very similar to his definition of movement. But the word consciousness has this negative connotation, and I really like that he was able to define a profound meaning in a word that hasn't been negatively connotated before. So if I was to explain the same thing in consciousness, a lot of people would be like, "Oh, it's not about consciousness, bro. It's just some spiritual boo-boo shit." But he said it as movement, and I was like, "Bro, you hit it from a very different angle." And basically, what he's saying is like this entity that exists in motion, right, and perpetual motion, and the same for stillness. The same for stillness, by the way, exists like as an entity and it functions from within us, and the way that we translate it as a container is different for each being, like for every single organism that lives, and each single individual unique organism, as in not even just a species, just like each snake, each human being has a different container for these movements. Excuse me. So each container having a different movement will translate it in a different way. And so the movement that is trying to communicate has a unique signature of the container, which is so important because as you speak, What you're trying to say is you're observing this compulsive movement that is occurring. What you're really doing is observing the content, the movement that is happening without your control, or sometimes with your control, you can do a voluntary movement, but you never know how minute of a fraction this entity of movement it is that exists, that's trying to communicate, right? Your emotion itself, or each neuron firing to the next neuron itself, is the movement entity that we speak of. And so that the way that it's translated in a human being, now I'm talking about the species of human beings, is observable by you. And if you are able to observe that, what you are observing is thousands and millions of years of evolution occurring from within you, and it's communicating to you. So your state of mind, for example, your confidence, your anxiety, your depression, is all going to communicate to you. How? Through a container. Let's remove movements from this action first, but it's important to understand that it's still communication. And we
Mm.
both know this, and we've spoken about this in
Yeah.
detail because we're writing a book on communication, so we feel strongly about this. But the that's the essence
Yeah.
of it, right? There's communication that's taking place between movement, the content, the entity that it is, and then the containers that express it, cause for, you would say, a um as we've defined it, an interschismic miscommunication. So maybe I'll not put that part in. Maybe we'll sit here and define it better. But what is occurring here is that the translation of movement that's happening through the container is uniquely different, and so each unique species has a different way of expressing what it is the state of being is in right now, right? It's movement. So
Yeah.
if your thoughts are creating a certain type
Mm.
of movement, your
Mm.
body will express it. If your body is creating a certain type of movements,
Yeah.
your thought will be expressed with it.
Yeah.
It becomes a very
Yes.
unique dance of container and content.
Mm.
And I think
Mm.
the profundity lies in where we can just sit back and observe it as aware human beings. And I think it's a privilege to be alive as a human being. And like as much as said about animals that can observe it or not, they're still moving, and I think there's so much to learn from these animals. As you rightfully said at the beginning, we not only can learn from all these animals, we have these movements downloaded in us, so fundamentally downloaded within us. So we can observe it and we can be inspired, but also to know that if you allowed the compulsion to speak and you were just to observe this compulsion, you would start to notice things like the spinal engine theory.
I feel very much, um, well, I say I feel, but I think whilst I was listening in my experience in dealing with Ido Portal, this particular thing did stick out to me quite a bit, but the way he phrases things is quite unique, at least for the sake of my experience of having met people describe it in very many different ways. He talks about this whole idea of being all inclusive, this content versus container, this movement with a capital M versus movements, the translational motion that is sort of just the medium for you to translate a higher, sort of more profound understanding, which we're still trying to come into grasp with, which is why he calls himself a practitioner in that. I think one very particular thing that I quite like that he keeps talking about is the organism as a whole. He talks about it as the what is it? The movement body mind system, right? He takes the musculoskeletal system that's basically the medium, like I was saying, the container, if you will, for these for the translation of this movement, and he takes he doesn't isolate just the locomotive part of the movement. It's not just the task is not always just to move your limbs or to organize your body structures in a specific way in order to complete a certain kind of physical task or in a task in the physical realm. He compares it to the movement of the mind as well, the same way that you were describing how your ocular vision was changing at each of those granular levels. In the quadrants that you were saying, he describes it in the form of the motion of the mind, emotions. And I think it's important to note that the the main takeaway from all of this is that everything is fluctuating, right? Everything is in movement, is in constant motion. And I think the beauty of it is that we're here to experience this movement whether we like it or not. And it's not a question of whether you want to experience the movement or not. It doesn't happen, to you. It happens for you. Rather, the other way around. It doesn't happen for you. It happens to you, which is great. So it's beyond your control. It's beyond my control. It's beyond anyone else's control. The most we can do is sit back and observe it and be taken along for the ride. But in certain circumstances and situations, such as the one that you described, an alternate, to a lesser degree, the thing that I described, we sometimes have the grace of being able to witness this thing in action. If you sit back and take the right posture, you actually, well, I say posture, but if you're in the correct position and in the right circumstance, you can create.
Yeah, I would like to interject here a little bit and just before you complete that thought, I would say that it's not just that we sit back and we're able to watch it, but I think being a human being and having that control is a large part of our metaphorical crawling to running phase from baby to adult. I think it's a very large part of becoming a
Mm,
full-fledged human being that we stop crawling in our brain. So what you defined right now, I would define as the mental crawling of a human being. Once you start to observe this more
mm,
and more, you
mm,
start to realize that there are openings for you to exist in a very non-compulsive way. And that, what does that do? That's basically you're
yeah,
taking control over your consciousness. You're taking control over a non-compulsive way of life. And I think that essentially is the goal of what this means to be. Like, yes, it is profound to sit back and observe it, and there are openings to do that. But the point of it is to do it to a part where you study the animal enough where you're able to reverse engineer what is happening, what you have been gifted,
yeah,
right, biologically, and then use that to then control it. Now you are in full control because you understand how it works, or you're starting to understand how it works. Maybe you
yeah,
won't die with the complete understanding of how sophisticated your biological animal is, but you might live a
hmm,
exponentially better life knowing 50% of it. For I believe that humans don't even know the 10%
yeah,
of how sophisticated our animals are. Apart from science, I'm not talking about science here. I'm
yeah,
talking about actual experiential, how do we use the system. It's one thing to cut open a human being and being able to observe the anatomy of it, and it's another thing when the same doctor doesn't know how to sit properly without his spine hurting, right? It's quite comedical when that happens.
hmm,
But that's the
hmm,
main understanding is I think that we move from that observance. First, we have the humility of going back and studying, right? That's the humility that we need to have to observe. And as you observe,
hmm,
you start to move. And then as you start to move, you create experimental movement. And the reason that you are able to experiment itself is the nature of you involving consciousness into it, because that is you experimenting. If it was truly compulsive at this point, Sandeep, it would become very posturized, which it is. So that means most humans are still crawling mentally,
right,
right? But what we truly need to do is
hmm,
understand that that's the
yeah,
posture. That's the point of it. So we understand the posture. We see how compulsive the movement is. We see and we study how compulsive evolutionary movement is. And then we start to learn. We start to grow. We start to experiment. In this experimentation lies consciousness, because you're moving away from posture, which is compulsive. So I just wanted
right.
to inject that here.
No, that's perfectly reasonable and perfectly valid to sort of complete the train of thought that I was going at, just so you know nothing is lost in translation, so to speak. But yeah, just to cap things off into what I was saying is just the observation part of it is a thing that I think most people take for granted. Not just the observation bit of it, but the fact that you most people just fail to recognize, like I was saying, life happens to you, it doesn't happen for you. Regardless of how you choose to approach this matter, and regardless of what it's not a matter of something that you can refute. It's not a claim that you can just be like, well, no, I am far more developed mentally or physically or whatever compared to other people, just because of your repeated sort of traditional exploration of the concepts of either physical or mental movement. No matter how much you train your brain or how much you train your physical body, you will, in fact, it's like It's a peak and then it drops very sharply, and that drop is more significant than people can recognize. You know, you reach the peak of your physique, great. People think it's always an upward slope. No, then the crash is crazy, and that crash is because you get so succumbed and so specialized into doing the thing that you're doing. It's actually quite detrimental, and you see that in the greats like, just to name a few, like fucking Ronnie Coleman, or
Mm-hmm.
all these great athletes, whoever you can think of. There's always a peak, but the drop is exponential, and vice versa for training yourself mentally. People get super specialized in being, great at one thing, one particular subgenre of one subject, and then they don't have the sort of capability to address more than that to any extent.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think that was the main point that I was trying to sort of get
Mm.
to, is that hyper specialization in any category
Correct.
in this whole movement, mind, body, system that we've got going on is extremely detrimental. And the idea is not to be like specialized in traditional movement in the context of movement that we're speaking about, but it's more to be more
Fluid.
to be able to experience the wide range of movement that we're capable of, to experience the whole capacity for us to both perceive, observe, and then utilize that movement. I think that's the most important thing.
I agree. You brought up something interesting when you were talking about the Ito Portal mind body system. Um, you said emotions, and as we speak of movements influencing emotion, you that is like Ito Portal's system, and he's created a very good understanding of what it is, but it's a very ancient understanding that I'm sure you know of already, but it's a very interesting topic to discuss. Yoga actually is a incredibly sophisticated system of how the human body works. A lot of people think that yoga is to sit and stretch, do the downward dog position, all this extreme violent corruption of what yoga is in the western side of the world, completely corrupted. And it pisses me off because it's such a sophisticated science and technology of how to use the body, and only one part of, like, I think possibly 108 different sections of yoga is about movement, asana related, right? Asana means positions. That's the only yoga asana is what everybody's trying to practice as yoga. And they're making it so like stupid.
Hmm.
They're doing goat yoga, they're doing sexual yoga, they're doing yoga with weed. Like, what are you trying to do with your life, and why? It's so funny for me to see. But anyway, yoga as a tradition has studied how deeply the human animal works as a full functioning system, right? As a full fledged system. And
Yeah.
yoga
Yeah.
asana, right? Now, when we speak about the movement aspect of yoga, which again is only one part of hundreds, is a
Hmm.
direct study and reverse engineering of how emotions affect posture. So, for example, when you go into a room and you walk into a room, can't you tell by the posture of one person that they are sad, anxious, confident? Cannot
Hmm.
you walk into a room
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
look at a guy who's, being very social, he knows his place? You can walk in and tell that he's confident. Or, on the contrary, you could walk into a room and clearly observe that there's this negative energy that exists, and somebody's like really sad, somebody's really anxious, somebody's
Hmm.
worried about something, and you see it. How is their posture when you look
Yeah.
at them, right? It's kind of sad. And
Hmm. Hmm.
what that says to us is that each emotion and each state of uh mentality that you have is translated in your posture, physical posture, and vice versa. So in the vice versa method, they've created yoga asana. So what they're now have studied and then created like a technical aspect of how to do it is yoga asana, where we use movements to induce um, certain mental results, not necessarily only emotions. It's easy for to explain that it's an emotional understanding, but the important term here is mind and body, right? And the mind doesn't just mean emotion. Mind means
Hmm.
anything that has to do with the neural system, really, right? So that's not just emotion, that's everything.
Yeah.
And something as
Mm.
complicated as that can be influenced with yogasana. And there's been multiple studies that have proven that yogasana affects the way that your consciousness is held. It affects the your level of awareness. I would take away that point of consciousness because nobody can really properly define it yet. So I would just say it's been proven to increase a sense of awareness. It's been proven to reduce more compulsive postures of thought, and it's also proven to increase a perfect relationship, not perfect, but a very good relationship between what postures can create what sorts of states of mind. And that's very, very, very
Yeah.
powerful. That's a very powerful tool to hold, right? Because you're in control now. And that's what yogasana has
Mm.
studied. But yeah, I just it's kind of sad what's happened to yogasana on this side of the world, and then you
Yeah.
realize that this side of the world affects our side of the world, which is the eastern side. It's so funny. Like yogasana comes from,
Mm.
it comes from India. It affects the Western. Then the Western creates media from yogasana, like fucking goat yoga, and then smoking weed and doing yoga. And then now Indians want to do it again. We lose our culture like that. It's quite sad. But there it's emotional responses from movement is a very deep topic
Mm.
to attack, because as I was doing this movement exercise, you start to realize that in experimentation, there are some hidden emotions that you have never felt in a very long time that kind of escape. And what happens is, like, you'll be doing movements that you haven't done before, or you'll be taking postures in certain specific ways that you haven't done before, and they induce certain thoughts that you needed to release. It's sort of a physical way of venting. It's a physical manifestation of venting your feelings and
Mm.
emotions. And what scientists have studied now is that there's emotional trauma capable of being stored in your musculature. How intense is that?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that is insane.
Yeah, and so that happens to people that do movement exercises, and that's not only in movement experimentation. It's not only the movement that I do, but it's in anything. In dance, for example, a lot of people dance and they start to cry in between because there's this emotional traumatic release that's happening. There's hidden feelings that we all have that we needed to vent, but communication didn't do it. Articulate communication didn't do it. So physicality has to do it. And likewise with meditation, but we'll get into that on another episode. But I wanted to bring up this point that I think you would find very interesting. Dr. Eric Jarvis, um,
All right.
he's done a very intensive research on how song and dance have come about into our culture, and why song and dance, he thinks, is the reason that we've developed a um, a complex cognitive function. And so one of his studies speaks about how animals with the ability of song, like with a good ability of song, not just
Mm.
being able to make some sounds, but animals that can sing like birds, they have a speech capacity, right? Like parrots, they have speech capacity, and almost every animal with the capability of speech has a capability of dance. And they think that that is what has affected evolution, as in dance is directly correlated to how you can how complex your articulation of speech is. And that changes like a lot
Okay.
for our understanding, because then we start to think that if speech can be articulated, movement can be articulated. And if speech can be articulated, then there's some form of thought, right? It has to be. And
Mm.
so, that's an interesting topic that I want to get into with hopefully like an animal expert at some point, where they start to decode what's
Yeah.
happening in a bird's mind, in a parrot's mind. Like there may be some type of
Mm.
self-awareness that we don't necessarily observe. Anyway, but
Yeah.
speaking of that relationship between movement and speech, you I
Yeah.
wanted to bring up the point that we recognize the more detailed your movements can be, the more articulated your speech is also.
Mm.
That means the more articulate that something else primarily is. Do you understand what I'm saying? There's like, if there's a
Yeah.
relationship between
Yeah.
speech and dance to be articulated with each other, there's something else that makes it articulate. There's something else that's advanced enough that makes it articulate,
Hmm.
which I believe is thought. And that it speaks to as why we have so much control on our movements, like our peripheral movements. We have extreme control. No other human being, I mean, no other animal species has the amount of control that we have on our movements in the form of detailed precision. No other animal does. And so that it irks the
Mm.
thought in me to think that the the practice of using peripheral movements in a controlled fashion allows for precision control over the capability of thought, the concept of thought, not thought in itself, but the muscle that allows you to think. So the more that you practice a
Right.
detailed precision way of moving, or the more that you understand the movement itself, or even speech, the more that you understand the singing
Mm.
aspect of it, the frequency aspect of it, and both in turn, like both of them together, you develop the muscle that thinks. And developing the muscle that thinks can offer more control. Like the way that you would develop your bicep to control more weight, you would control more thought. This is
Yeah.
a wild notion that I'm putting out, but this is something that it sits with me. It sits in a nice place as of now. I'm very open to what it could be. But you know, that's something that I wanted to pose to you. Like, what do you think about that?
Well, to be fair, I thought when you mentioned that it made kind of perfect sense with what you were saying earlier in terms of these, the mind and the body working together, and one affects the other, and vice versa. It's kind of an extension of that concept. As far as sort of, the capacity for speech goes in animals, or at least for articulated speech, and that affecting or that following through having some sort of significant correlation with dance. I never expected that to be a thing that I would, find out about. Although I can see why that would be, although I can appreciate why that would be significant, but it sort of begs the question, you know, is it is that correlation what the significance is all about, or is it more to do with the fact that we're now unraveling the idea that this significance is sort of in the forefront? You know,
Mm,
it's like the fact that we've uncovered it now doesn't change the fact that there was something there to uncover in the first place.
mm,
Trying to hyper extrapolate from it and trying to establish some sort of hierarchy within it doesn't make sense. More likely than not, it just reinforces the idea that the whole system is meant to work as a system and not as separate entities.
correct.
You know, the fact that yeah, the fact that you have like more articulation that comes from a better physical understanding of how your body's moving, and you have a better, you know, physical understanding of how your body moves because you have more articulation, sort of falls hand in hand with the concept that we're supposed to be functioning as a unit, and that
Mm.
unit moves towards bettering itself only once it recognizes itself.
That begs the question: evolution did evolution come from complex speech and movement abilities? Is that how we evolved? Is that how thought came about? Right? Because if movement is causing a more articulated form of thought, then I believe so. I've written it down too as one of the points that I wanted to discuss. I think the more accurate we became with language, the less we
Mm,
communicate. Articulation is not necessarily the bio,
mm,
whatever that saying is. Articulation is not the idea. It's not that we can create complex speech and articulate it. Actually,
mm,
articulation is taking away from communication, and this is something that we touch on very heavily in our upcoming book. That articulation is what
mm.
creates the confinement of communication and the misunderstanding. Um, hence, so
Yeah,
the more accurate we become with articulation, the less we communicate.
yeah,
And so all that all that means is like the more complex your ability to speak and the more complex your ability to move, the more neural networks that you're building within your
Yeah.
body, and the more neural networks possibly leads to a more sophisticated system that is able to think and everything as such. So we evolve like that. And I think it's true, because if you look back in evolution and you look at a chimpanzee, they don't have the same movements. They have very, very similar movements, but it's still not as complex as ours. It's not as detailed as ours, right? It's not as precise as ours. And that speaks, you can see the difference in cognitive ability between humans and chimpanzees. And I can't think of another animal that has more complicated peripheral movements than humans. I'm not saying there isn't, but as I say here right now, I can't think of it. Even dolphins, if you think about it, right? Dolphins like are supposed to be the next smartest species after us.
Yeah, I was
Um,
just about to say. It's like you
but
have
their
orcas
movement,
and dolphins, but I don't know if there's any concept of them having as strong of a peripheral movement the way that you describe it. It's more of a
correct,
cognitive function basis, you know.
correct, which is interesting because they don't have as nearly as detailed movements. However, it really
Yeah.
depends on how you use these movements, right? Like in the water, you don't necessarily need that much of a peripheral movement.
Mm,
So, like evolutionarily, what seems to work is
mm,
what you need. Humans started to develop more peripheral and
mm,
articulate movements in our body because we started using tools. And that's what furthered
mm,
evolution to, gain advantage to have peripheral and detailed movements. But in the ocean, you need wider movements. You need
mm,
more controlled movements, which you definitely see in the orcas and dolphins, because they could jump like
mm,
whatever feet in the air, like 12 feet from the water to the air. That's a
mm,
huge leap, like,
mm, mm,
so the ability to more advancedly control their movements is in my
mm,
perception the reason for their cognitive abilities. And also it's not just movement, but it's also strategizing. They're able to communicate with their community and create these strategic ways of attacking and hunting.
mm,
It just blows my mind when you read about what orcas and dolphins do to
mm,
hunt. It, I'm
mm.
sure we've looked over
Yeah.
it together, right? That's crazy. We should talk about
Yeah. Yeah.
animals.
Yeah.
I want to have like this biologist, like marine biologist, on the podcast once. Um,
Yeah.
we'll definitely look out for that. But it's interesting to see that dichotomy of um, less peripheral movements, but still more cognitive ability. But at the same time, it's also a fact that
Yeah.
dolphins, their brain to body size ratio is what we're looking at. It's not necessarily, and the density of cerebral networking, right? Yeah, I think you know better about this than I do.
Mm.
Um, the scale in what they're comparing is it's different. They're not necessarily saying that
Yeah.
they're smartest. It's a different scale that they're comparing.
Well, yeah, I mean, you compare it to the community itself, you compare it to the physical sort of size of the brain, to the body of the mammal, and you also compare it to what cognitive ability it's able to produce given the size of its brain and, whatever it is. The metrics aside, the idea that these people or these, well, I say people, I might as well, but that these animals can do the things that they can do is in and of itself the point. The fact that they function as a unit and the fact that we function as a unit. It's not a comparable scale. It's like that old Einstein uh, proverbial statement, how you compare like a fish to a duck to a cat to a monkey to an elephant.
Mm,
And
mm-hmm.
then you put them all on the same level and a scale, and
Exactly.
you say that you give them a singular task and ask them, and then you rank them based on that one task.
Right.
People use that typically to extrapolate from being like, oh, different people are good at different things, but you apply that same logic here, and then
Mm,
you start to realize what the importance of the thing that we've been talking about for so long is. And
right.
I think that's the more striking thing to put a nail on.
Absolutely agree with that. I think as we speak about movement, my most intentional message in this episode is that we as humans have
Mm,
a evolutionary momentum of existing locked unused potential in our system that makes us one of the most sophisticated animals ever to walk the surface of Earth. And in not being able to explore movement by repetition, in a cognitive limitation, a cognitive prison of thinking that repetitive movement and perfecting the craft of lifting weights in such basic, not even basic, I would say like immature movements, is causing a decline in the way that our cognitive abilities function. And I think that the way we as humans should propagate and evolve is to really incorporate fluidity in our movement and experimentation in the way that thought and movement are related to each other, in the way that emotions and movement are connected to each other, and just in the way that our body functions as a unit, rightly as you said. I think it's very important for all of us and all of you watching. If there's anything that you're going to take away from this, I implore you to experiment movement. Please don't stay inside the gym and just do like the same things and again. Obviously incorporate strength training, right? I have nothing against weight training. I actually think it's very important to strengthen your muscles and tendons, and it's very important to do the stereotypical gym exercises, but at the same time to understand that what you are seeking for is health. You are not seeking for larger muscles. You should not be seeking for larger muscles. And like, you know, what if I told you that I would like bump you in the head and I just gave you a larger bump in the head, so now you have a larger head and you must be smarter. Larger muscles do not account to any benefit in the real world after a point. And I make that very clear. After a point, strength is extremely valuable, but learn to balance. There needs to be balance. And like I said in the beginning, it's not a movement practice. It's a thought practice, and it's a united exercise that happens to fully explore your body. And movement it should not be segregated as something away from what we are doing. One of the most primal, fundamental ways of existing as a human body is to move in a physical planar, right? And so to really take that into account, experimenting is going to increase these motor neuron functions. It's going to increase the relationship between each neuron that functions. Your neural network is going to get denser and denser. You just evolve as a human, and more importantly, to understand the relationship between what already exists in your body is so important. And I think that these movement exercises really helps in that. And if you want a place to start off with, use this quadrant structure that I've just put out in the beginning of the podcast. Use the quadrants if you just don't know where to start off with. And I tell you again, there's no right way to do this. The only thing you need to activate in your mind is activate the concept of observing, and then just allow your body to do whatever it does, and just observe, and then experiment as you want. You're free to do whatever you want, but don't be shy. Don't be scared that people are going to watch and think you're crazy. I think that too. At least you're not alone, at least you can we can be crazy together. But just literally allow your animal to do whatever it's trying to do. Allow it to growl, allow it to grunt, allow it to salivate, allow it to snot, and just release everything. Like, doesn't matter, right? We're animals at the end of the day. We're disgusting beings. Like, just allow yourself to fully open up and try this and get back to me. Like I said, if you need a structure, quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4. Quadrant 1 is staying as close to the ground as possible. Quadrant 2 is a little bit higher, maybe the gorilla crawls. Quadrant 3 is spine sort of erect, squatting. What do they call that? The frog walk, the duck walk. And then quadrant 4 is a fully standing human being, just walking and observing. And notice all the things that I had said previously: your optical focus, your auditory perception. All of these things are hand in hand, and I would implore everybody to experiment that. And I'm very glad that we hit this topic early in the episodes, because I'm still very fresh with this knowledge. I feel like a fruit that has just
Mm.
opened a door to something, and I am also yet a beginner with everybody else. Um, and I will always be, because that's the point of experimenting. If I become a specialized person in this, then there's no point of doing
Mm.
this, right? Um, but I would definitely
Yeah.
like to have these certain movements in my arsenal that are specialized. That's a different concept, but that's awesome too.
Mm.
We should just quickly, if I had to briefly explain that too, like, yeah, it's awesome to be able to walk on your hands. It's awesome to be able to handstand. These are things that need repetition. Repetition isn't a bad thing, but it's when, like, Ido Portal, for example, says that he stops a repetition at 9 instead of 10, which, keeps the movement
Mm.
going, because it's like, oh, I thought we are gonna do 10,
Mm.
and there's like
Mm.
latent energy left there. So use
Yeah.
that, for example, to keep the process moving. Repetition is important to download information from your upper motor neurons to your lower motor neurons to make it kind of instinctual. Very nice to have that. Of course,
Mm.
spend some time doing that. But yeah, this is one of the topics that I'm very passionate about, and if anybody wants to reach out and talk about this, I would be more than delightful to explain this, structure that I've stumbled upon and created, this quadrant like structure. I think it works well for me, and works well for a lot of people that I've introduced it to.
Yeah.
And with that said, I think we can get it moving to a point where we can bring another expert onto the episode, and now we can see it from this perspective.
Yeah.
We can see their perspective as well, and yeah, soon enough
Yeah.
we'll bring an expert who's we already are in talks of bringing this guest on, who, as movement specialist. There's also very fluid, also very
Mm.
understanding of Ido Portal's nature, also very understanding of his own creative aspect of movement. Comes from a very traditional aspect of movement, as weight training and everything. So very excited to bring this guest on soon.
It's like the most beautiful way you could have put it. There's nothing I could say to top it, but you know, at the end of the day, it really is step one to actually recognizing the human animal and observing the human animal really is to first appreciate the fact that we are animals. And I think the broad summary of everything that we've spoken about today is just that. It perfectly encapsulates everything, and I think you've summarized it perfectly well. So I rest my case here, to be fair.
All right, peace out.
Till next time.
Have you ever heard of the spinal engine theory?
No, sir, what is it?
Sar.
Okay. Sir, I lightened the mood a little bit, sir.
Sar,
Okay,
good,
now we
thank
can
you.
start properly.